They said Rome could not fall. They said her legions were the thunder of the gods, her eagles the shadow of destiny itself. From the deserts of Africa to the frozen edges of Germania, every nation that dared to rise was ground into dust beneath the sandals of her soldiers. For centuries, Rome had stared into the eyes of kings, rebels, and conquerors, and every time she had won, her enemies came with armies. But what came next were not armies. They were men. Men with no empire to defend, no senate to please, no crown to lose. They came not for conquest, but for something far deeper: vengeance, freedom, and the will to break the world's greatest power. Rome had faced soldiers before, but never men like these. For centuries, Rome had stood like a mountain above the world, immovable, eternal, untouchable. Her marble temples gleamed beneath the sun, and her banners danced over continents, and her legions, oh, her legions, marched like a heartbeat that never faltered. To the world, she was not just a city. She was destiny forged in flesh and iron. Her enemies came in countless forms: barbarians with crude blades, kings with glittering crowns, tribes howling beneath foreign moons. They all came and they all fell. The earth itself seemed to bend before Rome's might. Roads stretched like veins from her heart, carrying her armies to every corner of the known world. Each conquest fed the illusion. Each victory whispered the same deceitful promise that Rome could never be broken. And so, arrogance took root where wisdom once stood. The Senate argued over glory while soldiers bled in faraway lands. Generals carved their names into history, not out of duty, but out of hunger for immortality. The empire forgot that greatness left unchecked begins to rot from within. You see, Rome believed she had mastered war. She had turned it into a science, disciplined, orderly, efficient. Her legions moved like machines, her strategies carved into stone. Every enemy was measured, every battle calculated. Rome believed that if she could count the enemy, she could crush him. But what happens when you face something that cannot be counted? When your enemy is not an army but an idea? The first cracks were whispers, tribes uniting beyond the frontiers, distant kings dreaming of Rome's fire. But the Romans did not listen. They could not. For in the marble halls of power, surrounded by gold and laurels, they had forgotten the sound of fear. And fear is what makes men cautious. Without it, even the mightiest empire walks blind into the storm. So when the storm came, it was unlike any Rome had faced before. Not a legion on a battlefield, not a rebellion in the provinces, but men. Wild, relentless men, born in the forests, forged in the sands, raised not by comfort but by struggle. They did not march in perfect lines. They did not sound horns or carry banners. They came like ghosts, unpredictable, untamed, and unafraid. Their eyes burned not with greed, but with something the empire could never understand: purpose. And in that purpose lay Rome's undoing. For when power faces passion, when empire meets desperation, discipline alone cannot save the day. The legions who once conquered worlds found themselves fighting not for glory, but for survival. In the cold forests of Teutoburg, in the burning fields of Cannae, in the ruins of forgotten frontiers, the illusion shattered. Rome had believed herself eternal. But eternity is a word only the gods can claim. And that day, when the blood of her soldiers stained the soil and the eagles fell from the sky, Rome learned a truth she had long buried beneath her marble pride: that no empire, no matter how mighty, is immune to time or to men who refuse to kneel. The illusion of invincibility was gone. In its place stood something far more dangerous: a reckoning. For once the world sees that even Rome can bleed, the legend unravels. The gods grow silent. The empire trembles. And somewhere beyond her crumbling borders, a whisper begins to rise. A whisper that would soon roar through history's corridors. A Rome faced armies before, but never men like thee. They did not come dressed in armor. They did not march beneath gilded standards or chant the names of forgotten gods. No, these men rose from the dust, from the forests, from the forgotten corners of the earth where Rome's light had never touched. They were the storm beyond civilization, the sons of the wilderness, the heirs of rage. Where Roman legions trained in formation and discipline, these warriors trained in silence and survival. Where Rome built walls to keep the world out, these men lived beyond walls, learning from hunger, cold, and war itself. Their tactics were not written in scrolls or studied in academies. They were carved into the flesh of generations. Hannibal came first, a man from the sands of Carthage, bound by an oath made before the gods of his ancestors. to never rest until Rome was ash and ruin. He did not sail to Italy. He did not come by sea as Rome expected. No, he climbed the roof of the world. Through the frozen hell of the Alps, with elephants trudging through snow and men dying by the hundreds, he brought the unthinkable to life. When his army descended upon the Italian plains, the Romans stared in disbelief. This was no ordinary enemy. This was vengeance wearing the face of a man, and then came others. Arminius, the ghost of Germania, a man Rome once called a friend, a soldier of her own legions. But in the shadows of the Teutoburg forest, he turned against his masters. 3 Roman legions marched in, confident, invincible. They never came out. In the rain and the mud, surrounded by howling tribesmen, discipline died and chaos was born. Arminius had shown the world that Rome could bleed, not from the outside, but from within. From the east rode another, a storm on horseback, Attila, the scourge of God, they called him. He did not fight for land or plunder. He fought to remind empires that their crowns were made of dust. His horsemen moved like shadows, their arrows falling like rain, their cries echoing like thunder across the fields of Europe. To the Romans, he was not a man, he was a prophecy. Each of these warriors, though born worlds apart, shared something greater than blood. They shared defiance. They were bound by no emperor, ruled by no senate, chained by no laws. Their kingdoms were the wild lands, their laws were survival, and their cause was freedom. Something even more primal, the right to stand against the impossible. Rome had built an empire on control, on order, hierarchy, and fear. But these men came from chaos, and they wielded it like a weapon. They turned the world's oldest empire into prey, forcing it to fight on terms it had never known. For centuries, Rome had dictated the rules of war. Now, those rules were burning. The unconventional had become unstoppable. The disciplined legions, the pride of the empire, found themselves facing ghosts that struck at night, vanished by dawn, and left behind nothing but smoke and silence. The empire that once conquered the world was learning to tremble. And as the smoke of battle drifted over the ruined fields, one truth lingered in the air, heavy, undeniable, eternal. Rome had seen armies before, but now she faced men who were more than soldiers. They were symbols of the world's awakening. And against them, even the might of an empire could not hold. There comes a moment in every empire's story when the tide that once carried it forward begins to pull it back. For Rome, that moment came not with a roar, but with a silence so heavy it felt like the breath before a storm. The world that had once bent to her will began to stir. From the burning sands of Africa to the endless forests of the north, the earth itself seemed to shift beneath the weight of something ancient, something Rome could no longer control. And then they came. Not in one wave, but in many. Like rivers converging into a flood, they rose, each one with a name that would echo through time. Hannibal, who shattered legions at Kenny. Arminius, who drowned the eagles of Rome in the mud of Teutoburg. And Attila, whose horsemen carved fear into the hearts of emperors. These were not mere battles. They were turning points. Moments where the invincible learned humility. Moments when the unbreakable began to crack. For centuries, Rome had written history in the blood of her enemies, but now others were writing in hers. At Cannae, the legions stood shoulder to shoulder, their formation flawless, their courage unmatched. But as the dust rose and the Carthaginian trap closed, perfection became prison. 50,000 Romans fell that day, an entire generation swallowed by a single man's brilliance. Rome had faced defeat before, but never annihilation. And yet, from the ashes of that field, she learned that even gods can bleed. In the dark forests of Germania, the rain fell like knives. Arminius knew every path, every shadow, every whisper of wind. The Romans marched in their columns, believing order would protect them. But the forest does not honor order. It devours it. 3 legions, gone, not captured, not defeated, erased. The empire's arrogance met the patience of nature, and lost. Then came the horsemen from the east. The Huns moved like fire. No borders could stop them. No walls could stand. They struck fast, vanished faster, and left only the echo of hooves in their wake. Rome had fought nations before, but this was something primal. A storm with no center, a hunger with no end. The tide had turned, and Rome could feel it. Her borders grew thinner, her heart heavier. For the first time in centuries, she was reacting, not commanding. And an empire that reacts is an empire already dying. But perhaps the greatest blow was not on the battlefield. It was in the soul of Rome itself. For as the world rose against her, Rome began to see her own reflection in her enemies. The ambition of Hannibal, the discipline of Arminius, the will of Attila, these were once Roman virtues. Now they lived in the hearts of her foes. The tide does not ask permission to change direction. It moves with the weight of time, unstoppable, eternal. And in that unstoppable motion, Rome's dominion began to fade. The empire that once claimed the world as its own found itself cornered by men who did not fear death because they had lived their whole lives beneath its shadow. The legions still marched, the eagles still flew, but the light that once guided them began to flicker. The tide had turned and the world was watching, and as the fires of battle burned on the horizon, one truth became clear. Rome's age of domination was ending. A new age was rising. An age not of armies, but of men who refused to kneel. There was a time when Rome believed herself eternal. A time when the marble of her temples gleamed brighter than the sun, when her emperors spoke and the world obeyed. She had built walls that touched the sky, forged legions that conquered the horizon, and carved her glory into the bones of continents. But eternity, as the gods well know, is a dangerous dream, for what man believes to be eternal has already begun to die. The cracks began quietly. Not with war, but with whispers. A senate too proud to see the storm gathering. Generals drunk on ambition, turning their swords not against Rome's enemies, but against Rome herself. The empire that once stood united beneath one banner was now tearing itself apart from within. And when the enemies came knocking, Rome was too busy fighting herself to notice the gates were open. The men who had once feared her now came to collect their vengeance. The Goths, the Vandals, the Huns. They came not as conquerors, but as witnesses to the death of an empire that had long believed itself immortal. In 410 AD, the impossible happened. Rome, the eternal city, fell. For 3 days, her streets burned. The sound of screams replaced the hymns of the Forum. Her temples, once filled with offerings to the gods, now echoed with the sound of looting and flame. And as the smoke rose into the heavens, even the stars seemed to look away. It was not the first sack in history, nor would it be the last. But this one was different. For it was not just a city that fell, it was an idea. The idea that Rome could never fall. The legions that had once marched in perfect unison were now scattered across the ruins of their own arrogance. The gold of her emperors could not buy loyalty. The laws that once shaped civilization could not command the hearts of broken men. And in that twilight of her power, Rome realized that all her strength, all her steel, all her glory had been built upon faith. Faith that she would endure forever. But faith without humility turns to hubris. And hubris always meets its reckoning. The men who brought her down were not gods nor kings. They were mortals, barbarians, outcasts, visionaries of destruction. Yet in their hands lay the truth Rome had long denied, that nothing built by man is beyond the reach of time. Empires do not fall in a day. They crumble piece by piece, morally, spiritually, silently, until the final blow merely confirms what history already knew. And so, the eagle of Rome, once proud and golden, now lay broken in the dust. But in her fall, there was something almost divine. Because even in ruin, Rome taught the world one last lesson, that power is fleeting and pride is mortal. That the stone that defies the tide will one day be washed away, and that every empire, no matter how eternal it believes itself to be, is only borrowing time. As the ashes settled over the Tiber, the survivors looked to the horizon and saw not the end, but the beginning of something new. For when an empire falls, the world does not end. It changes, it breathes, it remembers. And through the silence of her broken walls, one whisper endured, a whisper carried on the wind across centuries, across civilizations. Rome faced armies before, but never men like these. Long after the fires went out, long after the marble turned to dust and the legions became ghosts in the memory of time, the spirit of those who defied Rome still walked the earth. History remembers them as barbarians, rebels, destroyers. But those who look deeper see something more. They were the answer to arrogance, the balance to power, the reminder that no empire stands above the will of men who refuse to kneel. Rome's fall was not just the end of an age, it was the rebirth of the world. For in her collapse, something beautiful emerged. The truth that greatness is not owned by one empire, but born anew in every generation that dares to challenge it. When the dust of centuries settled, the names of those warriors still whispered through the pages of time. Hannibal, the man who crossed mountains to prove that destiny can be defied. Arminius, the traitor who became a legend, reminding the world that even the mightiest empire can be outwitted by its own creator. Attila, the scourge who stood before emperors and made them tremble. A living storm that shattered the illusion of divine rule. These were not monsters, they were mirrors. Reflecting back to Rome everything she had forgotten. Courage without pride, strength without change, purpose without empire. And in the centuries that followed, their defiance became scripture for the oppressed, the conquered, and the forgotten. Every peasant who rose against a tyrant, every nation that dared to break its shackles, every soldier who refused to surrender, all carried a spark of the same fire that once burned against Rome. For empires may rise and empires may fall, but the will to stand against them, that is eternal. Rome's story was not just a tale of conquest, but of consequence. She built roads and laws, yes, but she also built the pride that demanded her undoing. And when that undoing came, it did not erase her, it immortalized her. Because in the end, Rome's enemies did not destroy her legacy, they defined it. They showed the world that power means nothing without purpose. That civilization without humility is but a fortress of sand. And that even the mightiest walls will one day echo with the footsteps of those who dared to challenge them. The men who broke Rome did not build monuments of marble or write epics in ink. Their legacy lived in whispers, in the courage of unknown warriors, in the dreams of free nations yet unborn. They prove that history is not written by those who rule longest, but by those who refuse to bow the deepest. And though centuries have passed, their shadow still lingers in the heartbeat of every rebellion, every revolution, every stand against impossible odds. For what is freedom, if not the echo of defiance that first rose against an empire? So when we speak of Rome, we do not just remember her greatness, we remember those who stood against it. Those who taught her in the world that even the eternal can crumble, but the human spirit endures. And as time marches on, their voices still whisper through the corridors of history that courage needs no crown, that hope bows to no empire, that one man's fire can burn brighter than the pride of 1,000 legions. Rome faced armies before, but never men like these.